The fading light of the setting sun bathed the dense forest in hues of orange and red as the small group of hikers finally arrived at the entrance of the Black Forest. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine, while an eerie silence replaced the usual sounds of wildlife. Among the group was David, an experienced hiker who led the expedition, his sister Emily, who had reluctantly joined, and their friend Lucas, whose thrill for adventure kept the mood light despite the growing tension. Emily looked around nervously, glancing at the tall, twisted trees that loomed overhead. "Why does this place feel wrong?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. Lucas chuckled, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere. "It's just a forest, Emily. You're letting the legends get to you." David, usually calm and composed, couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease as well. Something about the stillness felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, but he shrugged it off. They had a clear goal: hike through the forest and reach the abandoned village on the other side by morning. As they set up camp for the night, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The group gathered around the fire, its warmth pushing away the cold creeping in with the night. David tried to keep the conversation going, asking Lucas about his latest hiking adventure. But Emily remained quiet, her eyes darting toward the trees as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. The silence stretched on, and then they heard it, a faint, melodic sound drifting through the trees. At first it was soft, almost like the wind whispering through the branches. But then it grew louder, more distinct, as though someone, or something, was singing a haunting tune just beyond the tree line. Emily gasped and stood up. "Did you hear that?" Her voice was shaking, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the source of the sound. David exchanged a glance with Lucas, who was no longer smiling. "It's probably just the wind," David said, though his tone lacked confidence. But the melody persisted, growing clearer with each passing moment. It was not the wind, it was unmistakably a song, low, melancholic, and strange. The notes seemed to wrap around them, tugging at their senses, making the air feel heavier, the darkness thicker. "David," Emily whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "We shouldn't be here." Before David could respond, the fire flickered, the flames shrinking to embers as if suffocated by the weight of the song. The forest around them felt alive, aware, as though they were being watched. The chilling melody continued to weave through the trees, creating an atmosphere that seemed almost tangible. Emily, visibly shaken, huddled closer to the diminishing fire, her eyes wide with fear. Lucas tried to mask his own unease with forced humor, but even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. David, despite his usual confidence, felt a creeping anxiety. The forest's eerie silence and the haunting song were disconcerting. He decided they needed to investigate, hoping to dispel their fears and understand the source of the melody. "Stay close," David instructed, grabbing a flashlight and motioning for Emily and Lucas to follow. The trio moved towards the edge of their campsite, where the trees seemed darker and the melody more pronounced. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the song grew louder, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine its direction. The path through the forest was uneven and treacherous, with tangled roots and low-hanging branches. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing ancient trees with gnarled branches and thick underbrush that seemed to close in on them. David's grip on the flashlight tightened. "We need to find out where this song is coming from. It's not natural." Emily, clutching her jacket tightly, glanced around nervously. "I don't like this. What if it's a trap?" Lucas, trying to stay optimistic, added, "Or it could just be someone else out here, maybe another group of campers or hikers." Their footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and undergrowth. As they continued, the song became more distinct, its haunting melody intertwined with an almost imperceptible whispering, as if the forest itself was murmuring secrets. Eventually, they stumbled upon a small clearing. At its center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its wooden frame sagging and its windows shattered. The melody seemed to emanate from within. David approached the cabin cautiously, the others following closely behind. The air grew colder as they neared, and the song took on a mournful tone that tugged at their hearts. David pushed open the creaky door, and the melody suddenly stopped. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty, filled with remnants of a time long past. A few pieces of old furniture were scattered about, and an ancient, rotting table stood in the center. The walls were adorned with faded, enigmatic symbols that looked as though they had been carved long ago. Emily shivered and stepped back. This place feels wrong, like it's alive. Lucas shone his flashlight around the room, illuminating more symbols on the walls. These look like old runes or something. Maybe it's part of the local folklore. David knelt by the table, examining a large, dusty book lying open. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten notes in a language none of them recognized. A strange sense of foreboding filled the room as David's fingers traced the cryptic symbols. The cabin's oppressive atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by a loud bang from outside. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panic surged through the group as the cabin was plunged into darkness. David, Emily, and Lucas were left to navigate their fear and confusion in the suffocating gloom. The melody started again, softer now but accompanied by an unnerving sound of footsteps approaching from outside. They realized they were no longer alone. The sudden darkness and the relentless melody heightened their anxiety. David fumbled for his flashlight, but it had gone out. Emily's breathing was shallow as she clutched Lucas's arm. Lucas, equally unsettled, tried to calm her down. "I'll check the door," David said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. He groped his way to where the door had been and tried to open it, but it was firmly shut. He pounded on it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering voices outside grew louder, mingling with the melody. The sound was almost rhythmic, like a chant that echoed through the walls. Emily, trying to stay calm, suggested, "Maybe we should try one of the windows." Lucas, his flashlight flickering back to life, directed the beam towards one of the broken windows. The glass was cracked and dirty, but it was their only option. David tried to pry the window open, but it was stuck fast. "Something's not right," David said, his voice edged with frustration. "This isn't just a cabin. It feels like it's being controlled." Suddenly, the cabin's interior grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift and writhe. The symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly, casting an eerie light across the room. Emily's eyes widened as she noticed something on the wall opposite the symbols, an old dusty mirror, partially covered by a moth-eaten curtain. As David and Lucas continued to struggle with the window, Emily approached the mirror. The surface was cracked and tarnished, but something in the reflection caught her eye. She gasped as she saw an image that didn't quite match the room's physical reality, a shadowy figure moving behind them. "David, Lucas, look at this," Emily called out, her voice trembling. David and Lucas turned to see what Emily was pointing at. They were met with the sight of the mirror reflecting a shadowy figure that seemed to hover in the room, despite no one being physically present. The figure's features were indistinct, shrouded in darkness, but its presence was undeniable. The shadowy figure moved closer to them in the mirror, and a chilling cold filled the room. David and Lucas quickly joined Emily in front of the mirror. As they stared at the reflection, the figure's movements became clearer, revealing a ghostly face with hollow eyes and a mournful expression. "It's not just a reflection," Lucas said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's like it's trying to reach out to us." The figure in the mirror began to speak, though its words were barely audible over the melody and whispers. "Help us. Free us." Emily's heart pounded as she listened to the figure's pleas. "What does it want?" David, trying to stay focused, examined the symbols on the walls. These symbols might be part of a ritual or a spell. They could be connected to whatever is haunting this place. Lucas nodded, glancing back at the mirror. "We need to find a way to stop this. We can't just wait here." The mirror's surface rippled as the figure grew more agitated. The melody outside grew louder, and the room seemed to close in on them. The temperature dropped further, and the cabin seemed to be alive with a malevolent energy. "We need to find out what this ritual is about and how to break it," David said, determination in his voice. Let's search the cabin for any clues. As they began to search the cabin, the mirror's reflection remained a constant reminder of the darkness surrounding them. The whispers and the melody outside grew louder, and the shadowy figure's mournful eyes seemed to follow their every move. The tension was palpable as they continued their search, each step bringing them closer to unraveling the mystery of the cabin and the dark force controlling it. The group split up to cover more ground, their flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The cabin's interior was a maze of clutter and cobwebs, and every shadow seemed to harbor secrets. Emily and Lucas headed to the far end of the cabin, where a rotting bookshelf stood. Meanwhile, David continued to scrutinize the symbols on the walls, hoping to find something that might explain their predicament. Emily's fingers traced the dusty spines of the books, searching for anything that might be useful. Lucas, rummaging through a box of old papers and artifacts, found a tattered journal wedged in between two dusty volumes. The journal's cover was embossed with a symbol eerily similar to those on the walls. "This could be it," Lucas said, holding up the journal. Emily nodded, and they began to flip through its yellowed pages. The journal was filled with cryptic notes and sketches, detailing a series of occult rituals and symbols. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a drawing of a similar symbol to those on the wall. "It looks like a diagram for some kind of ritual." Lucas read aloud from the journal, "To bind the spirits to the earth, one must invoke the ancient ones with the melody of the damned and the whispers of the lost." The word sent a shiver down Emily's spine. It sounds like whatever's happening here is tied to that melody and the voices we're hearing. Meanwhile, David's investigation revealed a hidden compartment behind one of the symbols. Inside, he found a box containing an assortment of strange objects, candles, herbs, and a small dagger with an inscription. David carefully examined the dagger, noting its craftsmanship and the intricate runes carved into its blade. "This could be important," David said to himself, his mind racing with possibilities. "It might be used in the ritual described in the journal." The group reconvened, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Lucas showed the journal to David, who scanned the pages with increasing urgency. "We need to perform a counter-ritual to break whatever spell is holding us here," David concluded. "This journal might contain the key to stopping it." Emily looked around the cabin, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the mirror's reflection. The shadowy figure mentioned "help us." "Maybe it's trying to lead us to something or someone." Lucas nodded. "We should look for any hidden spaces or items that might be part of the ritual." As they continued their search, the melody outside grew even more frenetic, and the whispers seemed to grow louder. The cabin's atmosphere was charged with an oppressive energy, making every creak and groan of the structure sound ominous. Emily noticed a trapdoor in the corner of the room, partially concealed by a pile of debris. "There, over there," she pointed. David and Lucas quickly cleared the debris, revealing the trapdoor. With a collective effort, they managed to pry it open, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the unknown. "Let's go," David said, trying to sound confident despite the fear gnawing at him. "We have to find out what's down there." The air grew colder as they descended the stairs, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The stairs led to a small underground chamber, its walls lined with more symbols and strange artifacts. At the center of the chamber was an altar, covered in dried blood and ritualistic objects. "This must be where the ritual was performed," David said, examining the altar. "We need to find a way to disrupt the ritual and free whoever is trapped here." Emily noticed a set of old tomes on a nearby shelf, their covers adorned with the same symbols they had seen throughout the cabin. She picked up one of the tomes and opened it, revealing detailed instructions for performing and disrupting the ritual. "We have to follow these instructions to the letter," Emily said, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. "If we can perform the counter-ritual correctly, we might be able to stop this nightmare." As they prepared to follow the instructions, the atmosphere in the chamber grew heavier. The melody outside reached a fever pitch, and the whispers seemed to merge into a single haunting voice that echoed through the walls. With the knowledge they had gathered, the group prepared to face the final stage of their ordeal. The dark force controlling the cabin was closing in, and they had to act quickly to end the terror and escape the malevolent trap that had ensnared them. The underground chamber was bathed in an eerie glow from the flickering light of their flashlights. The tomes and artifacts scattered around the room added to the foreboding atmosphere. Emily and Lucas carefully placed the ritual items on the altar according to the instructions in the tome, their hands trembling as they worked. David, holding the ancient dagger, studied the symbols on the walls with increasing anxiety. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the haunting melody outside seemed to resonate through the very walls of the chamber. Emily glanced at the tome once more. "We need to start with the incantation. It says here we have to recite these words to weaken the hold of the entity." Lucas nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'll read them. You and David, keep an eye out for any changes." Lucas began to recite the incantation, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. As he spoke, the ancient words, the symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, and the temperature in the chamber dropped even further. The melody outside grew louder, becoming almost unbearable. Suddenly, the chamber's shadows began to twist and writhe, forming indistinct shapes that seemed to reach out toward the group. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into fragmented sentences. David's grip tightened around the dagger. "Keep going, Lucas. We're getting closer." Emily scanned the chamber, her eyes widening as she noticed movement in the shadows. "There's something coming. We need to hurry." The whispers became clearer, forming a chorus of desperate, pleading voices. It was as if the trapped souls were trying to communicate with the group, urging them to complete the ritual and free them from their torment. Lucas pushed through the growing sense of dread and continued the incantation. The symbols on the walls pulsed with a faint, eerie light, and the shadows in the chamber seemed to shrink away from the altar. The oppressive presence in the room seemed to waver. Just as Lucas reached the final words of the incantation, a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The shadows converged around the altar, and a dark, formless entity began to take shape. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light, and it seemed to draw power from the very essence of the chamber. Emily grabbed the dagger from David and, following the instructions in the tome, prepared to make a ceremonial cut on the altar. "We need to sever the link. It says we have to make this sacrifice to complete the ritual." David and Lucas held their positions, their eyes locked on the dark entity that loomed over them. The growl grew louder, shaking the very walls of the chamber. As Emily made the cut, the dark entity let out a horrific scream that reverberated through the chamber. The shadows recoiled, and the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The entity writhed and shrieked as if in pain, its form becoming more translucent. The melody outside began to fade, and the whispers gradually quieted. The oppressive energy in the chamber seemed to dissipate, and a feeling of calm began to settle over the group. Emily, Lucas, and David stood together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The chamber's coldness began to recede, and the eerie glow from the symbols on the walls dimmed. The ritual had been successful, but the toll it had taken on them was evident. The group slowly climbed the stairs back to the cabin, their bodies weary but their spirits lifted by their triumph. They emerged into the night, the forest now calm and quiet. The oppressive sense of dread that had hung over them was gone, replaced by a fragile sense of relief. They gathered outside the cabin, their faces illuminated by the moonlight. The fire that had once been a source of terror was now nothing more than a distant memory. The forest seemed to have returned to its natural state, the sinister presence having been vanquished. David looked at the others, his face etched with exhaustion, but also with a sense of accomplishment. "We did it. The ritual worked." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "But we should be careful. There might be more to this forest than we know." Lucas, his voice steady but tired, added, "Let's get out of here and make sure no one else ends up in the same situation we did." The group gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, their bond strengthened by the harrowing experience they had endured. As they walked away from the cabin and into the safety of the forest, they knew that the shadows of the past would always linger, but they had faced their fears and emerged victorious. The dawn's first light filtered through the dense forest canopy, casting long shadows across the path the group had taken. Exhaustion weighed heavily on Emily, Lucas, and David, but there was also a sense of hope. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over them seemed to have lifted, and the forest was tranquil, almost welcoming. As they trudged along the path, the group began to notice subtle changes. The forest, which had once felt ominous and alive with a malevolent presence, now seemed oddly silent. The usual sounds of wildlife were conspicuously absent, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The air was still, and even the rustle of leaves seemed to have faded. "Is it just me? Or does it seem eerily quiet?" Lucas asked, glancing around nervously. Emily nodded, her brow furrowed. "It does feel different. Almost too quiet." David, who had been leading the way, suddenly stopped. He pointed to a series of fresh, deep claw marks on a nearby tree. "Look at this. These don't look like any animal I've seen around here." Emily inspected the marks closely, her face paling. "These are too large and too deep. It's as if something enormous and powerful made them." The group exchanged worried glances, their earlier sense of relief now tinged with unease. They continued walking, their pace quickening as the forest grew darker and the shadows deeper. Despite their best efforts, the feeling of being watched was palpable, like an invisible presence lurking just out of sight. As they neared the edge of the forest, a distant growl echoed through the trees. The sound was unlike anything they had heard before, low, guttural, and filled with menace. It was as if the forest itself was growling in response to their intrusion. "Did you hear that?" David whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice trembling, "and it sounds like it's getting closer." The group quickened their pace, their anxiety mounting with each step. The path seemed to twist and turn unpredictably, as if the forest was deliberately obstructing their way. The once familiar terrain now felt alien and hostile. Suddenly, Lucas spotted something unusual on the ground, a dark, slick substance that seemed to be moving. He crouched down and touched it cautiously. "This isn't normal. It feels almost alive." Emily's heart raced as she noticed similar patches of the substance scattered along the path. "We need to be very careful. Whatever's behind this might still be around." The growling grew louder, more insistent, and the group felt an overwhelming sense of urgency to escape. They pressed on, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they pushed through the increasingly dense underbrush. The forest seemed to close in on them, the trees twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. Just as they thought they might be lost forever, a faint glimmer of daylight appeared through the trees. The group emerged from the forest, finding themselves at the edge of a clearing that was bathed in soft, golden light. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. The clearing was eerily empty, and the peaceful appearance of the area belied a deeper sense of unease. In the center of the clearing was an ancient, weathered stone altar covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. Emily approached the altar cautiously. "This looks like it might be part of whatever we faced last night. But why is it here in the middle of this clearing?" David looked around, his face grim. "We need to be careful. The forest might have led us here for a reason." As the group studied the altar, they realized that the strange symbols were similar to those they had seen in the underground chamber. The realization sent a chill down their spines. It seemed that the malevolent force they had confronted might have left a deeper mark on the forest itself. Lucas pointed to a small hidden compartment in the altar. "There's something inside. Maybe it will give us some answers." Emily carefully opened the compartment, revealing an ancient, leather-bound journal. The journal's pages were filled with cryptic notes and illustrations depicting the same symbols they had encountered before. The final pages contained a series of unsettling drawings showing a monstrous entity emerging from the forest, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "This journal might hold the key to understanding what we're dealing with," Emily said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. David nodded, his expression resolute. "We need to read through it and figure out what this entity is and how we can stop it for good." As they prepared to delve into the journal's contents, the forest around them seemed to darken, the shadows deepening once more. The group knew that their journey was far from over and that the true nature of the forest's threat was still waiting to be uncovered. The journal's pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but Emily's hands were steady as she turned them. The ancient text was written in a mix of languages, some familiar and others completely foreign. The illustrations were crude but haunting, depicting a dark entity that seemed to merge with the forest itself. "This is fascinating but terrifying," Emily said, her eyes scanning the illustrations. "It looks like this entity has been linked to the forest for centuries." David leaned closer, studying the drawings. "The entity seems to have the ability to control or influence the forest. And these symbols," he pointed to a series of runes, "they're definitely connected to what we saw earlier." Lucas, who had been nervously pacing the clearing, suddenly froze. "Guys, I think we're not alone." Emily and David looked up, their eyes searching the surrounding woods. The peaceful atmosphere of the clearing was now overshadowed by an uneasy feeling. The forest seemed to be closing in around them, the trees whispering secrets through the rustling leaves. A sudden sharp noise broke the silence, a branch snapping underfoot. The group spun around, but there was no one in sight. The sense of being watched intensified, and the oppressive feeling from before returned with a vengeance. "We need to keep moving," Emily said, her voice firm. "There's something in these woods, and it doesn't want us here." The group gathered their belongings and began to make their way through the clearing, carefully avoiding the altar. As they walked, the sense of unease grew stronger. The once familiar forest now seemed alien, as if it had transformed overnight into a living nightmare. Suddenly they heard the growling again, louder and more menacing than before. The sound echoed through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. They quickened their pace, their hearts pounding with fear. As they navigated through the forest, the journal's cryptic notes provided some insight. The text described a ritual that could potentially banish the entity from the forest, but the specifics were vague and fragmented. "There's a reference here to a sacred site, where the ritual must be performed," Emily said, pointing to a passage in the journal. "We need to find this site if we have any hope of stopping whatever's tormenting us." Lucas glanced around nervously. "How do we even know where to look?" David scanned the trees and the underbrush. The journal mentioned something about the heart of the forest being the key location. "We need to look for signs that might lead us to it." The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees growing denser and the paths more confusing. It was as if the forest itself was trying to prevent them from finding the sacred site. They followed the cryptic clues from the journal, each step bringing them deeper into the forest's labyrinthine depths. As they ventured further, they stumbled upon a small, hidden grove. The grove was eerily quiet, the air thick with an almost palpable sense of foreboding. At its center was a large stone monolith, covered in similar symbols to those in the journal. "This must be it," Emily said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "The sacred site. But how do we perform the ritual?" David examined the monolith, noticing a series of grooves and indentations. "There might be more to this than we realize. We need to study these symbols closely and see if they match any of the rituals described in the journal." As they worked to decipher the symbols, the growling grew louder and the forest seemed to close in around them. The oppressive atmosphere was almost suffocating, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, his face pale. "We need to hurry. It feels like something is closing in on us." Emily nodded, her eyes focused on the monolith. "We're almost there. We just need to figure out how to use these symbols." The group worked quickly, their efforts punctuated by the occasional sound of breaking branches and distant growls. As they completed the final symbol on the monolith, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The forest seemed to hold its breath as a low, rumbling sound echoed through the trees. The sacred site was reacting to their efforts, but whether it was for better or worse remained to be seen. The ground continued to tremble, and a low, ominous hum filled the air. Emily, David, and Lucas stood frozen, watching as the symbols on the monolith began to glow with an eerie, pulsing light. The forest seemed to be alive, its movements synchronized with the light emanating from the stone. "What is happening?" Lucas shouted over the growing noise. David, his eyes wide with fear and fascination, answered, "I think the ritual is starting to work, but we don't fully understand what it's doing." Emily, her heart racing, focused on the journal, flipping through the pages to find any additional instructions. The journal's text was cryptic, but it hinted at a powerful force that could be unleashed or contained by the ritual. As the symbols on the monolith glowed brighter, the forest around them seemed to shift. The trees creaked and groaned, and the once quiet grove was filled with strange, whispering voices. The ground beneath them became unstable, as if the very earth was trying to reject their presence. "We need to complete the ritual," Emily urged, her voice strained. "If we don't, we might make things worse." David and Lucas helped Emily with the final steps of the ritual, each of them placing the appropriate symbols around the monolith as described in the journal. The tremors grew stronger, and the forest's whispers turned into frantic, almost pleading sounds. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted from the monolith, casting long shadows across the grove. The noise reached a deafening crescendo, and the forest seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The ground split open in several places, and dark tendrils emerged from the fissures, writhing and reaching out as if trying to escape. The trio stumbled back, their faces pale with terror. The monolith's light grew blinding, and a powerful wind whipped through the grove, making it difficult to stay on their feet. "What have we done?" Lucas cried out, trying to shield his eyes from the intense light. Emily, struggling to maintain her composure, shouted back, "We need to finish it. The journal mentioned a way to seal the ritual." As they frantically searched the journal for more instructions, the dark tendrils began to coalesce into a more defined shape, a monstrous figure of shadows and smoke looming over the grove. It seemed to be the entity described in the ancient text, a dark force that had been imprisoned within the forest for centuries. David, his hands shaking, found the final instruction in the journal. "It says we need to use a specific incantation to seal the entity away. We need to say it together." The trio gathered around the monolith, their voices trembling as they recited the incantation from the journal. The dark figure writhed and shrieked, its form shifting and changing as if in agony. The tendrils lashed out, but the light from the monolith seemed to push them back, forming a protective barrier around the group. As they completed the incantation, the light from the monolith reached its peak, and the dark figure let out a final, bone-chilling howl. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the monolith's light intensified, drawing the dark entity back into the fissures. With a final burst of light, the entity was pulled into the earth, and the fissures closed, sealing it away. The forest fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the light faded. The grove was once again peaceful, but the remnants of the ritual's power lingered in the air. Emily, David, and Lucas stood in the center of the grove, exhausted and shaken, but relieved. The monolith's glow dimmed, and the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "Is it over?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the now calm forest. "I think so. The entity is sealed away, but we need to be careful. The forest might not be entirely safe yet." David looked at the monolith, his expression a mix of awe and weariness. "We've done what we could. We need to get out of here and let the forest heal." As they prepared to leave, the forest around them seemed to return to its natural state. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and quiet. The grove, though still eerie, now felt like a place of reflection and closure. The trio made their way back through the forest, their journey back marked by a newfound sense of peace and hope. The darkness they had faced was now behind them, and the forest would eventually heal from the ordeal. The sun was beginning to rise as Emily, David, and Lucas emerged from the forest. The light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The forest behind them, though scarred, was slowly returning to its natural state. The oppressive weight of the night had lifted, replaced by the serene calm of the morning. "I can't believe it's over," Lucas said, his voice tired but relieved. "It feels like a weight has been lifted off our shoulders." Emily nodded, her gaze still fixed on the forest. "We did what we had to do. The entity is sealed away, but we need to be cautious. The forest might still have lingering effects from the ritual." David, carrying the remnants of the ritual equipment, glanced back at the forest. "I hope the forest will heal. We should report what happened to the authorities, but we need to be careful about how much we reveal." They made their way to the nearby ranger station, their steps heavy with exhaustion. The events of the night had taken a toll on them, but they were determined to ensure that the forest was protected and that others were informed of the dangers they had faced. At the ranger station, they were met by a concerned ranger named Sarah, who had been keeping track of their whereabouts. "You're back. What happened out there? We've been trying to reach you." Emily took a deep breath and began explaining their ordeal. She was careful to omit some details, focusing on the immediate dangers they had faced and the actions they had taken to protect the forest. Sarah listened intently, her face growing pale as the story unfolded. "That sounds incredible. I'll make sure to notify the higher authorities and have the area inspected. We'll need to be vigilant to ensure that nothing else comes through." After their debriefing, the trio was given some time to rest and recover. They were provided with food, clean clothes, and a place to sleep. The ranger station, though simple, offered a much-needed respite from the trials of the forest. The next day, they were approached by a team of experts who came to inspect the forest. They were equipped with specialized equipment to assess any lingering effects of the ritual. The experts, though skeptical at first, were soon convinced of the gravity of the situation. Emily, David, and Lucas assisted the team, showing them the locations of the ritual sites and providing any information they could. As they worked together, a sense of camaraderie developed, and the team began to respect the trio's bravery and determination. While the experts conducted their assessments, the trio took some time to reflect on their experiences. They found solace in knowing that they had played a crucial role in protecting the forest and that their actions had prevented a great evil from being unleashed. David, sitting by a small campfire, shared his thoughts. "We've been through so much, and it's hard to believe it's finally over. I just hope the forest can heal and that others will be safe." Lucas nodded in agreement. "We've done everything we could. Now it's up to the forest to recover and for us to move forward." Emily, looking out at the forest, felt a sense of peace. "We faced unimaginable challenges, but we came through stronger. The forest will heal, and so will we." As the days passed, the forest continued to show signs of recovery. The once dark and foreboding grove began to return to its natural beauty. The ritual's effects were gradually fading, and the forest regained its tranquil and mysterious aura. Emily, David, and Lucas eventually said their goodbyes to the ranger station and the experts. They had forged lasting bonds through their shared experience, and their friendship was strengthened by the trials they had faced together. With a final look back at the forest, they set off on their separate paths, each carrying the weight of their experiences, but also the knowledge that they had made a difference. The forest, now free from the darkness that had once plagued it, stood as a testament to their bravery and resilience. Though the memories of the night would linger, the trio knew that they had played a crucial role in preserving its mystery and beauty for the future. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.